All right. Hey, everybody. Oh, good. I think my screen has already frozen. I hope you can hear me okay. Welcome to this edition of the Agronomists. I am Lyndsey Smith, your host. This is a great picture, Jay. I really hope we can keep this one for the whole episode. Big shout out to Dan, who was our first commenter tonight. Usually it's John that gets in there and is trying to steal my job and does the intro for me. So there you go. Welcome, John. Good to see Warren here as well in the comments. Yes, this is a live broadcast. It is live stream. We welcome your comments. Get in here early, comment often, all those sorts of good things. Yes, Warren, such a flattering freeze frame. All right, and before I do intro my guests, I did want to remind everybody you can get CU credits for watching this broadcast, so make sure you head over to realagriculture.com/agronomists. Tomorrow morning, the episode will be there and you'll be able to sign up for that. All right, nobody needs to see my frozen face, so let's bring in our guests. We are talking corn and soybean diseases here, and I have plant pathologist with OMAFRA, Albert Tenuta, and of course, corn guru with the University of Guelph, Ridgetown Campus, Dave Hooker. Welcome here, gents.
Welcome. Hey. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Looking forward to it. This is awesome.
It is. And thanks for saying yes.
It is.
At least people can hear me, but apparently it's just going to be a frozen face of mine. I don't know. Let's blame the Wi-Fi. Either way. All right. So let's start with, we're in a heat wave, and it's going to be even worse out west. But certainly it's hot and muggy here. Dave, I'll start with you. What do the crops look like in your neck of the woods?
Well, I think on the most part, they're exceptional. This spring has been one of the greatest springs that we can remember. Just in terms of earliness, moisture-wise, it was a little bit trying at first. Seed depth was very important to get that to that moisture and to start the germination process. But overall, it's a spring that I would like to have again, except for slug damage on my own farm. Besides that, everything is okay.
Yeah, Dave, that wouldn't have been wheat on wheat, would it?
All right, and Albert, what are you seeing?
Well, just think it. We're waiting for it's warm. We've got humidity. We've got moisture out there. We're inoculating our corn plants already for northern corn leaf blight. So if you're a fungus or a pathogen, you just love this weather. And that, but yeah, as Dave said, things have been moving along quite well down this way. There has been some variability in terms of moisture in that, but overall, with the rains that came through this past weekend, in some cases from a couple inches to 6 or more, moisture is not an issue right now, and we'll see what happens the rest of the year.
Yeah, I think the struggle in some fields right now is excessive moisture.
Yeah.
Yes. Right. And we were quite dry. I mean, I'm here in the eastern province, we had a pretty dry winter. And we had an early start to spring. And, we were dry and needed some rain, but definitely seeing some of those flooded fields is a little hard to take, hearing 6 inches plus in some areas in a pretty short amount of time. Yeah. So that's when you need snorkels. Yeah, snorkels for crops. I'm still working on the patent for that one. I don't think it's going to work. All right, so thankfully, the two of you are mostly going to do my job for me because you sent me fantastic graphics and photos and all sorts of things, and then we won't have to look at my frozen face anymore. But before we get to some of those, again, everybody, make sure we've got two fantastic extension staff here, so let's make sure we get those questions in. But Jay, let's maybe go to the first clip because I want to kick off the evening talking tar spot on corn. It is here in Ontario. So let's go to clip one. This is a corn school featuring Albert Tenuta and our own Bern Tobin. We'll give this a watch and then we'll head on into talking tar spot.
We have been talking about a disease called tar spot for about 4 years. And Albert, you have found it.
Yes, we found it here at Ridgetown. Actually, one of my colleagues, Jonathan Brinkman, noticed this particular plot that we have the other day and said, hey, can you take a look at it? And I think we found something unusual, and he hadn't seen it before, and it turned out to be tar spot. And you can see that based on what we're seeing, it's pretty obviously why they call it tar spot. And going through it, we're in a pocket here that has a considerable amount of tar spot, and it doesn't take too long to go outside of this area. Well, you'll see very little as well. Yeah. Hey, one thing you'll notice is that there are different lesion types out there. These are your typical stroma or tar spot lesions where you see that nice tar spot stroma on the leaves, no true border or tan spot around it. Very typical of what we would see. Now here on this other leaf, if you look closely here, you'll see again we have that tar spot, stroma, and some other critters coming around here, but you also start seeing this halo or tan spot around it, or what we call the fisheye type lesion also associated with it. So don't be surprised if you see both type of lesions even on the same leaf.
A leaf disease that's had a big impact in Michigan and Illinois and other places. Talk about the impact there, Albert, and why it took so long, shall we say 4 or 5 years, to find its way to Ontario.
Well, as you said, it first came into the U.S., from Mexico, etc., where it traditionally had been, in 2015, into Indiana, Illinois. And as with any disease, it takes a bit of time to build up the inoculum and get a foothold in a certain area and then expand. And we've seen that going right up to last year, as we said, and we've done a number of stories, as you said, up to the Canadian border in 2019 where we've seen it. And so environment plays a critical role when it comes to any of the foliar leaf diseases, and tar spot's no different than that. And so those years like 2015, 2018, those were the years that they had the greatest impact on yields in the Midwest US. And a lot of it was because the disease started much earlier. It likes cooler, wetter conditions, humid conditions, and those conditions were earlier and prolonged, which allowed the disease to get a foothold.
Yeah. What type of impact? Up 30, 40 bushels?
Yeah, it can go anywhere from, in this case here, we're gonna have minimal, right? But there you've seen anywhere from 10, 20, 30, 40 and above. Again, the earlier, the more susceptible the hybrid, the greater the impact.
All right, let's hope that this works. I reconnected. Doesn't look like it's any better, but I'm gonna keep trying. All right, so right off the hop, yes, thanks, Francois, it's true. Getting excited about a lesion shape is probably not a thing that most people do. So, thanks for that. But okay, so Paul Herman's out here in Eastern Ontario has a question. Tar spot, what percentage of Ontario corn could be affected versus other major diseases like northern corn leaf blight?
Yeah, no, that's a good question, Paul. In terms of right now, if you pull up slide number 1, Jay, there you can see that in Ontario, right as of right now, for tar spot, we are looking at Essex, Chatham-Kent, Lambton, Elgin, and Middlesex counties, and we have not seen it past that point. And again, it's just starting, just same as 2015 in the US. It took time to build up. So we do have it here. The inoculum is here. It's overwintering. Our risk still will come from the US side in terms of the major spore movement in that. So it's going to be concentrated more to the southern Ontario in that. So you've already taken our punch later. Dave and I were going to bring this up. Is tar spot is important, it's new, etc. It's got a potential risk there, but do not forget about those pathogens and diseases we already have, such as northern corn leaf blight, gray leaf spot, gibberella ear rot, and those as well.
Okay, and Dave, what oh good, look, I'm not frozen again. That was a really good one. It looked like I was sneezing or swearing. Could have been doing both. Anyway, you, as Albert says, it is moving. How does tar spot spread?
Well, Albert is really the expert on this, and I'm just a lowly agronomist, and trying to understand, trying to get excited about plant diseases, but it's hard to get excited about plant diseases when they cause so much destruction And plant diseases get me upset because they occur in the field. They happen in the field, and sometimes we mismanage them. Anyway, to get to your question, as Albert mentioned, I think, and Albert can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it mainly overwinters. But my question to Albert is how much spore load actually comes from the U.S. versus overwintering?
Yeah, so a lot of that will, again, depend on the amount of infection. So last year, as we said, we had the 5 counties. The number of fields within those were like 1 or 2 within those areas. The highest we had was just outside of Rodney here, where I would say it would be 60 to 70% of the plants in certain areas had it, and maybe 5% of the leaf area was infected. So the amount of overwintering will occur will be very minimal in that particular case. So our load is still going to come from Michigan, for instance. And so the local movement from spores from field to field, you're looking maybe at 1 kilometer or 2. It's when it gets higher up into those storm fronts, right? Same as what we talk about with all the rust diseases and other airborne pathogens. That's when you can get greater movement over and that. So again, and so for us, the risk will be down here. For Paul and those out east, it's probably going to be more than likely, we may see it this year closer to Toronto, and then over into Eastern Ontario probably next year.
Mm-hmm. In terms of management, Albert, I read somewhere that the infection time, it can vary tremendously. It could be 2 weeks, or it could be up to 40 days. I heard some other expert mention 40 days, like between infection and symptoms showing up. And so how would you time a spray? Like, what would you do when you go out to the field and you're trying to make a spray decision?
Well, as we do with any spray decision, first you got to get out there and scout, right? You got to assess your risk. Yep. And with that side of things, we need to first see when. And so this is an important piece right now. And if you go to that slide number 2 on there, as we showed in that video, right now we're going into July. And normally, regardless of whether it was an epidemic year like 2018 or 2020, 2019, maybe more of a normal year, these symptoms, whether you see the tar spot symptoms or those fisheye symptoms on the leaves or on the ears themselves later on, they start around that mid to 3rd week of July. That epidemic year in 2018, Michigan was seeing it July 8th. So we're just getting into that time frame where we're going to start potentially seeing it over the next 3 weeks or so. More so, again, we've got plots out in Rodney where we're doing hybrid screening, fungicide trials with that. And Dave, to answer your question, when the disease starts, it takes about 4 weeks or so to start ramping up and getting that inoculum load. So even when it was infected July 8th or so, it wasn't until, say, that a month later that you started seeing symptoms. You started seeing down low some injury and then you get that snowball effect that can happen in 2 weeks. So weather drives a lot of disease, right? So again, those moderately cool temperatures or moderately warm temperatures play a factor, but it's the moisture, it's those rains. And if you look at that on the right side of that slide there, you see little Florida down there, that yellow spot, it's already down in Florida. Florida's hot, right? So we know it can tolerate heat. It's moisture that will drive this disease for sure in that regard. So be out there, scout, and we'll talk about the timing side of that is I would expect it's still going to fall in that tassel timing that we would normally be looking at from an application standpoint.
Okay, and we are going to get to that. I do want to point out we've got a couple comments that have come in. Warren Schneckenberger, he's out east of even me, so Western Quebec. And he says tar spot has been confirmed as far as Syracuse on the New York side. So there's the possibility, potentially, I suppose, of it coming up that way, potentially. And Dan's got a question with recent storms coming across this early in the season. Is the U.S. far enough ahead for those spores to move?
Yeah. So as of right now, we have not seen any indication of any infection going on just yet. So you're going to see that local infection occurring now. It's been so hot and dry for much of that Midwest area that hasn't started the inoculum load. But these storm fronts that have just come through are the ideal vector to move those spores in. So we would be looking at Michigan right now for those spores that would more than likely be coming in because their weather condition would be a bit more favorable than, say, what we would have seen in Illinois or Indiana. It's still a little too early. I would wait till probably that a couple of weeks from now. If we can continue to see these patterns, then we'll start seeing a buildup of the spores as well.
Because it is a polycyclic disease.
So now,
right. That's a key one, that polycyclic side of things. So we talk about that with rust, right? And that's where you can see that snowball, right? Until you start getting a little bit, starts creeping. It takes about 2-3 weeks or so. And then all of a sudden you're looking at 7 to 10 days or so to double and build up quite quickly.
Okay, so now we will get to some soybean management, of course, but Dave, this question is for you. John says that they have 50 acres of corn that was planted and emerged close to 40,000 plants per acre rather than the target of 34,000. This is in Bruce County near Lake Huron. Starter fertilizer also went on heavy. What extra management should we employ to help this crop along? We think it has 300 bushel an acre potential. I'm just going to suggest that they first calibrate their equipment and their operators. But then secondly, what sort of management with super high populations and maybe some really rich starter would you suggest?
Yeah, in term, like, this is a disease show, so this is this really fits well, I think. So we got a very lush canopy there. Well, we'll have a lush canopy, or should have potential, if the rains keep the crop going. And so I would be more inclined to spray a fungicide in such situations. And so in our high management trials, our intensive management trials, we did look at that high population treatment. And so those populations, of course, generate the thicker canopy, and that really favors a lot of these, especially the leaf diseases, that thicker canopy does. And so I think we just need to be, include that in our fungicide decisions. We're going to be talking about a ladder approach or risk factors when we consider making a fungicide decision. And I think this would be a significant risk factor that one would need to consider whether to spray a fungicide or not, and that is the environment and the susceptibility of the host as well.
Yeah, the other side on that one too is not only on the foliar disease side, Dave, too, is potential for stalk rots too, right? With those higher plant populations, especially with the rains and that just came through as well, especially if there's any considered flooding, and that the stalk rot risk could increase as well.
Yeah, that's right. And we know that stalk rots, the effect of stalk rots, especially if they're fueled by the lack of photosynthate, to feed those stalks later in the growing season, a fungicide will help to maintain stalk integrity, and it does reduce the potential of lodging as well.
Yeah. And if you're in a silage situation, then that increases your risk too, say for dawn and stuff.
Yes.
Sorry, we're having this conversation between the two of us.
We're absolutely going to get there, but no, that's okay, because I'm going to completely do a squirrel, because I love Lara's question here, and she's going to help me with the pronunciation. So, huitlacoche, so corn smut. Have either of you ever eaten the corn smut? I have found it in fields, and I always it. Looks. You have? Okay, so is it delicious?
It tastes like chicken. No. It's got an earthy taste. It's got an earthy taste to it. It'd be a lot like a puffball or something like that as well.
Okay. I had never eaten puffballs before I came to Ontario. I didn't know those were a thing either. So there you go. Okay, so Dave, have you ever eaten, huitlacoche? I think that's how we say it.
No, I haven't, but I've considered trying to give it to my students and ask them what they think. And so questionable things, I feed them to my students.
That's a far better idea, actually.
Let them
nice.
Let them figure that out.
We'll have to
Nice
find out if
teacher I
Yeah,
am.
that's a
Laura
way
has
better
had it.
idea. I like that a lot.
Yep.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. She says my pronunciation is close. So that's close counts in horseshoes and curling. So that's fine by me. Okay. So let's switch gears a little bit. Let's head to our second clip, Jay. I'm doing very well. Usually this show is the journey to the next clip and we never get there. But I do want to bring in, of course, Paul Hermans is saying here, if the grass is green, white mold will be keen, something along those lines. And so with all this moisture we've had and all this humidity, we of course need to be talking about some soybean diseases as well, particularly white mold. So we're going to go to our second clip. This is Ken Curra, and this is from our soybean school, and talking about making sure that you're headed out there early enough in the season to make sure you're getting that white mold control in place.
What stage are we going to be looking at for application and timing? Maybe before we get there, maybe you really got to think about how this crop is shaping up. What's it looking like?
Yeah, so the crop is variable. In my territory, which is London and Niagara Falls, lots of clay. Things have been dry, things look variable. You go further north, things start to look a little bit more solid. Now I'm hoping that most areas got enough rain over the last couple of days to kind of push that unevenness out a bit and get things up and going. So funny that we would talk about fungicide. A lot of people would think we're talking about fungicide on soybeans too early, but this timing actually sneaks up on us pretty quick.
What growth stage are we looking for? How do we effectively time our applications?
So for the most part with our soybean fungicides, we're looking for that R2 stage. And what we're going to see there is going to be pretty easy to find flowers in that crop. We're going to see some flowers up on the top nodes of the soybean plant. We're also going to see, in particular for this fungicide timing, let's look for that first soybean pod on the lower node there, lower two nodes, that's starting to develop. So it might be a quarter or a half inch long, pretty small, but that's cueing pod development, seed set, grain fill period, and that's really the timing we're looking for that first fungicide application. We may err a bit on the early side for fields that we know have a history of really bad white mold, where it's basically regardless of the weather, we're going to see white mold in those fields. Low topography, high fertility, poor air circulation, heavy growthy stands. We might manage that a little bit earlier with a white mold fungicide, but for the most part we're looking for that R2 stage, which may come in just a hair later.
How about coverage? How important is it that we hit that flower?
Yeah, coverage is everything when it comes to fungicide. So we're looking for, regardless whether it's a white mold product or a plant health product with the strobiluron mixed fungicides, we're looking for 20 gallons an acre of water. We want nice coverage there.
Final question for you, and that is multiple passes and managing white mold. How do as I say, what's our strategy there?
Yeah, so white mold management can get pretty complex depending on what part of the province you're in, field history. If I recall correctly, 2014 and 2017 were pretty tough white mold years in a lot of areas. And here we are. If you were able to hold your 3-crop rotation in the late spring of 2019, you're in soybeans in those fields here in 2020. So remember that field history and maybe manage accordingly. I really look at it with producers is we kind of have 2 levels of white mold risk. If we know that we're at pretty severe risk of white mold, we know we have to manage the crop. We can't manage the weather. If we know that field has a history and a high risk of white mold, I'm going to lead in a 2-pass program with a true white mold product like a Cotegra, something that is targeted specifically to white mold, and stop that white mold infestation before it starts. We have to remember that the white mold products in the marketplace, unless there's been a label change somewhere that I don't know about, all the white mold products in the marketplace are labeled for suppression. So we're trying to hold down that disease, hence the sequential pass. If we're under high risk, we might want to do that second pass, and that would lead into the R2 to R3 range 7 to 14 days later as a strobiluron mixed product, which will extend some white mold protection. But the big thing is we'll be putting that strobe into the soybean plant when it's starting to build yield, right? Give it that shot of plant health and start building yield.
Well, I don't know where some of those white mold pictures came from, but they're hideous. So, Albert, I'm sure you think they're beautiful, but they're kind of hideous. Okay, so Albert, walk us through why it's so imperative that if you're in a high white mold risk situation, that you head on into that crop so early?
Yeah, so we're already starting to flower down this way, and so as Ken had mentioned, there's a couple of different strategies there, and if you're in a high risk history of white mold, the favorable conditions. So that includes everything from narrow rows, higher plant populations, high fertility, history, weather conditions, etc. You're going to be in there scouting early as possible. And in that regards, we're looking at, as he mentioned, and Dave will come in here as well. You're looking at that 2 versus 1 application window in there, and so that early are 1.5 to early 2, and then later on to that 2 to 3 or 3.5 can help us in those high risk situations in that. And then that target one of that R2.5 to R3 as a single application for mold, as well as other foliar diseases, is in there. But you've got to get in there. There are other tools that can help us now. There's new disease forecasting models such as Forecaster, Field Profit, and those two that can assist in helping target those fungicide applications. But remember, it depends a lot on all those risk factors, right, Dave? And those are important. So it's just not the weather that drives disease as well. You've got to look at the whole risk package. And Dave, you want to bring us up on some of those?
Yeah, risk factors for white mold.
Yeah, or just in disease in general. You just go for it.
Risk factors, and we talked about it already. One of them is canopy. So how dense the canopy is, and I think for white mold, that is one of the top ones. I think a very dense canopy, narrow rows, maybe a little bit higher plant population than what you anticipated. There's a lot of soybeans planted out there I know they're planted a little bit higher than what the recommended rate is, and those are the fields that would be at one of those high risk situations, given other risk factors as well, given the environment. There's lots of moisture around right now, and right at start of our stages, and I think we have to be aware of all these risk factors and susceptibility of the variety. We know that the pathogen is likely there, so all kinds of risk factors, and I think we need to really sharpen our pencils and not make a management mistake, especially when the commodity prices are as high as they are today. We just can't afford to make a management mistake. And I think white mold is one of those ones where we can make a mistake, and especially mistiming of the fungicide application.
Yeah.
Well, and so there's how long then, Albert? I'm familiar with out west, it's called sclerotinia. It's the same disease, right? On canola. Yep. Sunflowers are susceptible. Essentially, our bean crops are susceptible. So, and like Dave alludes to, with strong prices, there's a lot of soybeans that maybe went on soybean ground. So we've maybe got some beans on beans. Probably lots of them, actually. And so how long do those sclerotia stick around? Is 2 years out of beans enough to lower that risk level, or would it really need to be more than that?
Yeah, no, those sclerotia can live anywhere up to 8 years or more in there. The key is where they reside in the soil profile, right? So if they're in the top couple of inches or so, then those are the ones that are going to be the biggest risk for that year to produce those beautiful apothecia that we see on there. And if Jay can pop up slide number 6 on there, you can see just how beautiful those apothecia are, and the key there in terms of that timing and the results there, not only from what we're seeing in Ontario but elsewhere, support that timing of that R1, R2, and then follow up again with that later application. And in our white mold nursery trials that we've got at Agriculture Agri-Food Canada at Harrow over the past 3 or 4 years, we've seen multiple products, particularly those ones that are targeted primarily for white mold. Even a single application under those high disease pressure situations can get us a significant yield bump on those. All our products gave us a yield bump. It's just whether they were 2 or 3 bushels versus up to 14 to 18 bushels, right? And those are the key. And so if you've got well-timed timing there, both in a single or a double application, we've got a significant response on 80% of our fungicides that we used in those. So we can manage them. It's just getting that timing on there and targeting those fields that are the highest risk there. And as Ken had mentioned, those single modes of action products, if they're timed right, work well. If you're going to do a 1 application, then you're going to be targeting more of that R2 to maybe 2.5 in that range. If you're going for the double application, you're going on that earlier before that R2 and then follow up to that R3, maybe just a little bit past that.
All right. And Dave, I want to switch gears a little bit here because we've touched on it briefly. And of course, we are going to talk about fungicides. We're going to talk about proper timing and all those sorts of things because it's a significant tool we have and it's needed. But we also have genetic resistance to some diseases or tolerance, or of course the flip side, we have susceptibility differences. So when we're talking about diseases, where do the genetics come in as far as just how powerful a tool they can be?
But genetics, I think, top the list. Of all the risk factors, I think genetics tops them all. We could solve the Fusarium head blight in wheat if we had resistant wheat varieties, but we have to resort to other management strategies to reduce Fusarium head blight in wheat. And the problem is that we don't have resistant wheat varieties. If we did have a resistant one, then it would make the management a lot easier to give us some more options, tools in the toolbox. And so therefore, I think that genetics plays a big role in disease management strategies.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, absolutely. We've got great examples of everything from northern corn leaf blight to syndrome, soybean cyst nematode. White mold is one that we don't have the level of genetic resistance that we would love to have to start on it, and hence that's why we need to bring in those fungicides and other integrated integrated white mold management tools there. But remember, those if you're in a bad situation, fungicides will only make a bad situation less bad under those really severe conditions, right? So you've got to your expectations also have to be respectful of what the expectations are there as well. So look at these other tools and that are there, and remember, every field is different. And there's no difference in, there's differences in fields, and application timing is critical. Epidemic initiation as well as the duration isn't the same every year. And so I know Warren before this on Twitter was saying, give me a little bit of white mold, give me some white mold. And he knows that if you got white mold, that means you got high yield environments, right? It's that fine critical line between having maybe 20 or 30% mold in that field to quickly becoming 50 to 60% and then starting to hit you in the pocket. That's the key, and that can happen so fast.
And another interesting thing too regarding disease scouting and management strategies is that one could sorry, my headphones are acting up here. But one can use go to the first fields, the fields that are planted into a more susceptible variety or a hybrid, and scout for symptoms in those fields first. And so those are the fields that would really respond the most to a management strategy that may include fungicides, ones that are planted into a more susceptible hybrid or variety.
Okay.
So Dave, you're saying that. Go ahead, Albert, and then I'm gonna bring in some comments here, but you go ahead. So Dave, what you're saying then is disease management it's we're talking about it right now, but it starts even before we get to the field, right? It starts in the winter. It starts right now with the scouting, being aware of what's going on, and using that information as you plan for next year.
Yeah, yeah. A lot of the time, so growers, like, yield trumps just about every characteristic. Yield is still number one. So sometimes you select the best yielder, and then you have to really sharpen the pencils on both ends, right, to make that high yield happen. And sometimes a disease might creep in, and you might have to manage that. Yeah,
absolutely. Sorry, Lyndsey.
Yes. So John. No, it's okay. It's great. John notes, though, that Sean needs to spring for Starlink so that we won't have this frozen face. And I'll have you know, John, that is absolutely on the list. But for my area, it says late 2022. So I have a bit of time to wait before Starlink is going to be in my area. But we'll try. But I've got a question here on cereal rye. So Gord wants to know, does a cereal rye mat reduced white mold risk in soybeans? Warren, tongue-in-cheek, says it reduces the risk this year because the beans are so poor growing through the mat of rye. But we do know, of course, that cereal rye can help with weed suppression, but does it have any impact on white mold?
Yeah, so on part of that is, I like Warren's comment there, but so part of that too is, remember I mentioned that the sclerotia that are in that top two inches, right? And so by having some residue or matting on top of it, that can result in those apothecia not being able to shoot their spores into the air and then infect those petals and that as well. So not get those spores into the canopy and initiate infection. So it's basically can act as a barrier to that as well.
But the risk for white mold is lower in no-till. No-till. Yes. No-till.
So, Dave, you're partly right as usual on that one, in that, sure, because of the residue and they're on the soil surface, the half-life there can decrease and all that stuff, but it goes back to proper management. And look at him, he's being terrible. We'll talk later. But if you're in a poor rotation, Dave, would you not agree, though, that you could be in a higher risk that following year in no-till because you've left more sclerotia on that soil surface? So again, it goes back to good management, right?
Yeah, but if in previous years I didn't have white mold, there wouldn't be any sclerotia on the surface or close to the surface. So it depends, Albert.
Yeah, but then no-till wouldn't help you in that regards with white mold because you don't have that risk. You doofus. Oh. Anyway, go ahead.
I love that this might be the first episode that someone gets up and leaves and flips the table right in the middle of it. No, I'm just kidding. All right. So, but Warren says, all right, so by that logic, corn stalks should intercept spores. And it isn't just that you aren't disturbing the sclerotia. So is it like a physical barrier, or are we let's just rotate and we'll be okay?
Yeah, so the corn stalk's not quite the same way in terms of that matting that you might get with some of the oat cover crops or rye and those as well. So that it interferes. Plus, it also smothers them out at that same time. With the corn stalks there's still enough ways for them to get through and shoot those spores. I've not seen any data showing that no-till corn stalks in that regards will lower it per se from a disturbing the sclerotia side there. Dave might argue differently, but it's more the fact that they're on that soil surface and that they are more prone to predation, UV, environmental conditions on the survivability of those sclerotia.
Yes, I agree.
First time you agreed with me. Good stuff. I'll buy you a beer next time, Dave.
Oh, there you go. Lara wants to know, any chance it has a similar effect of oat residue might have on Aphanomyces spores. So Aphanomyces, of course, is this nasty disease in Western Canada that's impacting pulse crops. Any chance oats might help there?
Yeah, I don't know enough on that one. If we're talking about airborne diseases or that, then more issues. If we're talking about root rot type diseases and that not, it's already colonized in the soil and they're going to colonize that soil and then infect that way as well. So less of an impact on those root rot type diseases.
Okay. All right. We're going to get to clip 3, which is amazing. And Dave, you may recognize the gentleman in this clip. It's you. And we're going to talk about, we're going to switch gears back to corn. I know, right? And this year, of course, conditions are perhaps a little different in that I think you could say the corn crop probably looks a lot more uniform than perhaps in past years. So this clip is from a few years ago at Diagnostic Days when we could have it in person. And so we're going to go over the clip of staging the corn crop when it's variable, but of course the principles apply for getting that fungicide timing exactly right. So we'll watch this clip and we'll come back to discuss.
Now, Dave, in your presentation today, you talked about, the emergence of the corn crop this year was actually a lot better than you thought it would be, but you still got some variability.
Yeah, we got some variability, and this variability, of course, is very important when we want to time a fungicide. We want or expect a lot out of fungicides, actually. When a grower wants to apply a fungicide, they expect good disease control, or they expect for that fungicide to deliver what it's supposed to do. And fungicide timing, the timing of fungicide relative to crop development, is extremely important. And so when we want to time a fungicide, of course, we expect a uniform crop, but we know that never happens. A uniform crop across the field, plant-to-plant variability, it's never uniform. We expect it to be uniform, but it's almost never uniform. Now, this year we have planting. The planting has been late. Conditions have been less than favorable, but overall, we are surprised in how good some fields are. Unfortunately, stress introduces a lot of variability into the fields, and this stress could cause higher variability, which could compromise or complicate our fungicide application timings.
Yeah. Talk about that timing, Dave, and the variability. You mentioned, you've got that narrow window at silking, but with all that variability around it, it complicates it.
Yeah, it complicates it because we have some variable plant stands right here. So for instance, the ideal timing for a fungicide application for corn is about a 6-day window or so. But if we have variable plant stands such as this one, this later emerger one, it could silk maybe 2 weeks or 10 days past the normal crop. If we have a lot of plants in this field, of course, the timing of that fungicide application would be uncompromised between the late emergers and the early ones. But I think the most efficient use of fungicide application for the timing would be to apply a fungicide when the majority of plants are within that target window.
Talk about that target window. It's 6 days, Dave, and if you hit it, you've got a good percentage of control, but you got to be there.
Yes, so it's a 6-day window for reducing gibberella ear rot in dawn and corn. If that's our main target, we have to time our fungicide application within this window. So most plants are within this window. So between full silk, green silks, to when the silks begin to brown, that really marks the end of that application timing window when the silks begin to brown. But if we have plants that have not flowered yet or have not silked yet, those plants are beyond that fungicide application window, and we will get reduced control. So there's very good data that show this fungicide application decision is very important for reducing gibberella ear rot in dawn and corn. And here is one. So untreated check, dawn levels were between 6 and 8 parts per million in this replicated trial. But if we wait until we spray one of the fungicides such as Proline or Carumba within this green silk period, we can expect about a 50% reduction in dawn with reasonable dawn concentrations that are in the background that are potentially possible.
Okay, back. We're going to see if I can stop freezing I don't know. I keep leaving and coming back. Nothing seems to work. Okay, Jay, can you bring up? I think we have that last giant placard you held up there, Dave. I think we have a slide of something like it or something very similar.
Yeah.
So
8.
let's talk about that silking timing and talk about what's going on here. What years are these? Are these the same years, or is this a different?
No, these are 2 years. A few years ago now. So this is a lot of the work was done by Art Shasma's group, and I was involved in this as well. I've been working with corn fungicides for quite a few years now, looking at leaf disease control, and also the latest, I think, urgent need is to control gibberella ear rot, which produces mycotoxins. And so I think this is the greatest problem that we have in the Great Lakes area, is just the mycotoxins that can be produced with favorable conditions. And U.S. Midwest, like leaf diseases, of course, they're at the top of the list. But in the Great Lakes region, really mycotoxins really take the priority. And so I think we really need to time our fungicides in order to kill two birds with one stone, so to speak, right? So time our fungicides to control leaf diseases if we have to, and maybe even to control Western bean cutworm with an insecticide, but also to control or reduce the risk of elevated concentrations of mycotoxins. And so this slide really shows a lot of that work that we did in corn, and we did the same thing with wheat like 20 years ago, and that's why we have such great management strategies in wheat, and really we're doing this in corn now. We have been doing this in corn for a few years. But as you can see, right around silking time, from green silk until the silks just begin to brown, that's when the fungicides, the registered fungicides for reducing the mycotoxins, that's when they have the greatest activity. Now, that video that you showed a couple minutes ago, that was from a couple years ago, but we have another fungicide available now to add to the two that exist, and that is Miravis Neo.
Yeah.
Yes. So back up just a little bit though, because of course this is silk channel infection, but as you mentioned, you did mention the Western bean cutworm. So the connection there, how much of an impact is Western bean cutworm feeding on potential down the line gibberella infection?
It has a very big role in mycotoxin potential. Western bean cutworm does, and so that causes wounding. So the fusarium can get into the ear. Gibberella can start into the ear by silk channel through the silks or through wounds. And so the Western bean cutworm or even hail damage can cause wounds to the ear, and that could introduce the pathogen, which then produces the mycotoxins. So we have to time these things, these applications. It takes a lot of scouting and a lot of management. I guess the pressure to decide on whether to include an insecticide that would control Western bean cutworm pressure. Like there's so much information, so much decision, such a huge decision that has to be made right around soaking time. And I think we just need to make sure that we make the right decisions, because if we don't, it could cost us yield and leaf disease. If we have leaf disease pressure, and it could cause a huge reduction in grain quality as well. And it could cause other issues as well, both grain quality and yield by if we don't control Western bean cutworm.
No, and I agree with you, Dave, on that one too. But remember, though, 2018, which was our worst epidemic that we've had in terms of corn, it would be the equivalent to 96 for wheat, and that was truly a classic silk channel infection, right? Classic gibberella infection, very little secondary infection through Western bean cutworm and that. So the risk still, in my opinion, is that these can contribute to the dawn levels and the disease, but that true infection through the silks is still our biggest concern that we have there, and can cause us the biggest impact both on yield and grain quality as well. In there as well.
We just have to be aware that Western bean cutworm, when it's there, it can cause a big impact as well.
Yep, it's another factor in that side. Same thing with when we talk, we get asked a lot about silage too, right? And so with the silage part, we get a lot of questions. Well, it makes no sense. I've got no gibberella ear rot infection there, but my silage numbers are up, right? And so there, in that case, there's two contributors to the dawn issue on silage. It is from the ear, but it's also from the stalks. Right. And so if you've got both of those, they each can contribute mycotoxin or dawn individually. Just because you've got high levels of dawn or ear rot doesn't mean you're going to have stalk rot, and vice versa on that. They're independent of each other. And so that is also something that causes us issues on the silage side too, those two different factors.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, so Albert, I want to geek out just a little bit. Is gibberella on corn, so corn ear rot, is it the same pathogen as fusarium on wheat?
Yeah, so we're talking about Fusarium graminearum, right? And so, so we have those. So gibberella, we call it Gibberella zea. So we'll go on the geek side from sexual and asexual reproduction, but basically, yes. How's that? Does that work okay?
Okay. Yeah, that works. Okay, and then Dan has a comment, which I do want to explore this a little bit, because you mentioned, of course, Dave, the importance of scouting, the importance of hybrid selection, and then, of course, that ladder of making that decision. With variations in growth, Dan says they aim for 75 to 80% of proper timing, and always best to have more, but it never happens. And so that's just it. Is if you have a lot of ground to cover, it's not a very large window, and you need spray conditions where you can get across that field too. So how do you suggest farmers sort of and agronomists make that game plan?
Well, this is one of the I guess the outcomes, or one of the main talking points on how do we deal with high mycotoxins coming out of the year 2018. That was that epidemic here, right? Or was it 2019, Albert? I forget. Time flies.
No, it's 2018. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yes. Okay. Yeah. And one of the talking points was that to have multiple hybrids. So some of the farms that had the highest dawn levels, just relied on one or two hybrids on, maybe 1,000 acres. And that was putting all of your eggs in one basket. But if a farm grew 6 hybrids, or a hybrid every 100 acre per hybrid or something like that, grew multiple hybrids, that means your risk would be spread out over a longer period of time, and also your silking date would be spread across a longer period of time, and then you can manage those silking dates a little bit better. But I just think that one needs to be ready, have the sprayer ready to go, and have option B and option C, just in case those first priorities or first options didn't work out, because timing is very important.
Okay. So I do want to because we're quickly running out of time, which this has been lots of fun. So thank you both for sharing all this info, because it's great. But we want to talk about a little bit about corn leaf diseases too. And as you mentioned, Albert, we started off with tar spot, and both of you want to stress that tar spot might be the new disease, and we need to keep an eye on it, that sort of stuff. But we can't lose sight of sort of the more common ones, the ones that we know are going to be there kind of every year. So what is our timing for northern corn leaf blight as far as control? How does that line up with potentially controlling some of these other fringe diseases?
Yeah, so the really good part and part of the work Dave and I are doing with our colleagues in the U.S., and that although we haven't had tar spot as of yet, and we've set up trials for those, we have been able to look at those other common corn diseases we have, such as northern corn leaf blight and gray leaf spot and that. And the good thing is that we've got the products that can work for tar spot are the same products that we basically have for northern corn leaf blight, gray leaf spot. The timing situations are the same. So if we're looking at that tassel to R1 till silken application, that works both for the foliar leaf diseases that we have, as well as say tar spot and that. And as Dave mentioned, if we're targeting the gibberella ear rot, the dawn side of things, then you're gonna shift that maybe a little later into that full silk, green silk, into that as well. So that gives you more window. And the really cool thing there is that a lot of the products that are coming out now that are showing to be the most efficacious and having a greater residual, these 2 and 3 ways have multiple modes of action. So we're not talking just as a strobe type or the group 11s. Now we're talking DMIs, the SDHIs. You're seeing those 2 and 3 way modes of actions that are giving us a better consistency. And consistency, I use that in a rough way, in that those are showing better response. So now we're seeing what, Dave, up to 60 to 70% response to our fungicides. Response doesn't mean return on investment as well, right? So you've got to bring into account the economic side, right? And as Dave mentioned earlier, when we're looking at $15, $16 soybeans, $6 to $8 corn, all those things, that starts moving those return on investments higher up, where you need less bushels to pay for that. And I don't know if Jay's got slide number 3 there. That was a good example of what we had in our trials that we've had at Ridgetown for a number of years. This was from 2019, and I guess the slide didn't come up so well there, but the key one there is that we saw under this northern corn leaf blight inoculated trials, we saw up to 50 to 60 bushel loss, right? This is on a susceptible variety. On our resistant variety, as Dave said, that can help us. We saw about a 15 to 17 bushel loss. So just that one tool there, by using the right genetics, we reduced our risk, and having those fungicides in there now can move us, in some cases, some of the newer products in there. We've got an experimental at the top, and then Veltima, which is a new product in the blue one from the top, then the Miravis Neos, the Headline Apps, Carumbas, the Trivapros, the Prolines, the Deleros, and those ones at the top there all provided good yield control up to, getting 30 to 40 bushels of that 55 back. And that. So we have the tools, we have the timing, we can deal with tar spot, but keep it in mind. But remember, the risks you have now are already in your field.
So Albert,
Yes.
why would I spray a fungicide at VT? Why not wait until it's R1 or the silks are slightly browning, and then I can control leaf disease? I can see if there's a white Western bean cutworm issue. I can maybe throw an insecticide in there, right? Or I can reduce my risk in jib and mycotoxins. Why spray at VT or even before VT? Like, that's popular amongst some growers as well. Why would I decide to spray pre-VT or at VT? Like, why would I do that?
Yeah, so when we say VT, we're saying VT-R1, right? So that tassel to silk, because it's so short a window in that regard. So a lot of it comes down to management too, right? How many acres you have, and trying to get those acres in there. And so Dave, to answer your question, those higher risk fields that you would be targeting for would be, it depends on your risk factor. If you've never had dawn, or it's not an issue or so in those regards, and that, you could go on that earlier side and that. But I agree with you. I'm one of those. I would rather wait till you start getting into that more, what we call that jib or ear rot timing, because you get still the leaf disease control, you get to reduce your dawn as well. You can have a better understanding. I know, I agree with you. I know, and so if your Western bean cutworm is a contributor in there as well. But again, remember, if you're on 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 acres, you've got a lot of stuff, a lot of spraying to do if you to get it done in that short window too, right, Dave?
Yeah, that's right. I have to be really
careful. What do you do on your farm?
Well, I usually don't spray a fungicide at all on corn, just because the the risk factors just aren't there. So I choose my hybrids that are relatively low in jib or mycotoxin production. Like, that's what I would do. And leaf diseases would be very rare. So I scout, and usually there's no leaf diseases there. So that's the history of, I guess, the corn on my farm. But it's
again,
different on others, for sure.
But that's the whole point there, is that you've got to know your history, you've got to know each of your fields, and you got to base it on that as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And every year is different. And like I just said, go ahead, Lyndsey.
Well, I was just going to say, Dave's corn must know that, if he gives them a stern talking to, don't they know who he is? They're not allowed to come down with terrible diseases and other things because it would make you look bad. So that's it. So there you go. Yeah.
Oh, I've got some bad crops.
I wish that worked.
I've got some bad crops to show you. Bad crops of mine.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's perfect. I
post them on Twitter, and the experts say that my system is out of balance and things like that. And so I've got some things to work on, I guess.
Yeah, I guess. Well, you know what? Life is a journey. It's always good to have goals, things to improve for next year. So there you go. I wanted to say, though, the one thing, Dave, when you start talking about, I'm going to target Western bean cutworm and I'm going to get the fungicide in there, and then my brain starts going, is there a risk in trying to do all the things in one little window as opposed to trying to right time based on what the risks are? Maybe not in this instance, but overall, it's sort of like, is herbicide timing really disease timing, or is insecticide timing really herbicide timing? Often they're not at the same time.
No, they're not, and sometimes they're off a little bit. But I think we do have an opportunity to get all of those things at once. If they do, if all the stars are aligned, if you got leaf disease, if you got gib, the risk factors for gib are there, and Western bean cutworm, that does happen in some fields, but it's really quite rare to have all three happen. I think all three risk factors happening for each one of those pests on the same field, but it is possible.
Yeah, and then you throw in 2018, where we had rains and delayed harvest and all of those conditions, so we had secondary infections. So again, that disease triangle, and Dave hasn't even brought up the disease triangle yet because he always loves to jump in and do that before I can. So remember, you got to have the environment, you got to have the host, the susceptible host, and you got to have the pathogen. Any one of those out of kilter are going to either increase or decrease your risk for disease. And ultimately, whether we're talking corn or soybeans, the common factor in terms of getting that consistent response and getting that consistent return on investment is having disease present, right, Dave? Our corn trials from Ontario, what is it now, 1,200 or 1,500 comparisons or more? The top, we can get 75% response back, but the top 9 bushels or more is where we've got disease, right?
Yeah, that's in our slide 4. If we have time to put it up, I'm not sure if we do.
Sure we do. Go ahead, Jay, throw it on.
So this is one of my favorite slides, and Albert and I have done many comparisons over the year. Look at that, is that 13,000, 12,000? Yeah, comparisons. And so there's a lot of data that have gone into this. And you see that middle number of 5.7 right at the top. That's our average yield response with fungicides applied at VT, between VT and R1. But on 25% of the fields and more, we get 9.7 bushel or greater. So those are the fields that have that disease in them, right? That have that disease potential, have those risk factors.
Should I go and come back? Okay. Apparently I'm here. My screen is completely frozen. So I hope I'm not interrupting everybody, but we do have to wind this down. Our time is up. It's after 9 already. A big thank you to my guests and to Dave and to Albert. Thanks so much for sharing with us. And we will be back next week. We're going to be talking tissue testing. So meet me back here on the live stream, 8 p.m. Next Monday night. Bye, everybody.
Great.
Take care. Thank you.